Marry her, Lord Peverell said, laughing so hard the wine trembled in his glass, and we will call it a kindness done. Marry her, Fenwold, and every debtor of yours at this table is forgiven. That is the wager. That is the punishment. The word landed in the smoke and candle heat of the card room like a struck coin, and for a moment the Duke of Fenwold did not move. He had heard a great many foolish things spoken at this hour of the night, when the brandy had loosened better men than these into cruelty. But he had not expected to be handed a bride across a green baize table as though she were a forfeit token, or a horse, or a bad debt to be settled by the throw of a die. Cassian Everleigh, 9th Duke of Fenwold, sat very still and let them believe he was considering it. He was not. He was watching them, the four flushed faces leaning in, the gleam of teeth, the way Peverell's fingers drummed the table's edge in delighted anticipation, and he was thinking, with the cold clarity that came to him only when he had been pushed a step too far, that he had never in his life so thoroughly disliked the company he kept, and which unfortunate, he said at last, have you elected to sacrifice to my temper? They loved that. They always loved it when he spoke of himself as a thing to be feared. For they had built the legend themselves and dined out on it for 3 winters. The Duke of Fenwold, who had buried a father and a brother inside a single hard year and come out of that grief silent and unsmiling, the Duke who danced with no one, courted no one, and turned upon any hostess bold enough to seat a hopeful daughter beside him a look so flat and final that mothers had learned to keep their girls 3 seats distant. He was 38 years old, rich beyond the counting of most of the men at this table, and he had let them think him cruel because it was simpler than letting them think him sad. Miss Ashcroft, said young Harborne, and there was a snigger in it. Marigold Ashcroft. You will not know her, Fenwold, and there's the beauty of it. No one knows her. She has been coming out for, what is it now, Peverell? 4 seasons, Peverell supplied, delighted. 4 whole seasons and not a single offer. Her mother trots her up and down the assembly rooms like an unsold mare, and the poor creature just stands against the wall, plain as a dinner plate, mending fans for the other girls and fetching their lemonade. Her people are respectable and ruined. Good blood, no money, a father who gambled the last of it away before he had the decency to die. She is, in short, the least marriageable woman in London. He raised his glass, which is precisely why she is perfect. Wed her, and you humble that pride of yours before the whole ton. It will be the joke of the season. The great, cold Duke of Fenwold, shackled for life to a wallflower nobody wanted. The others laughed again, but Cassian did not, and something in his stillness made the laughter thin and die. He knew the mother vaguely, a fluttering, anxious woman in an old-fashioned turban who had once been pointed out to him at some crush of a party as a cautionary tale. He did not know the daughter at all. He tried to summon a face and could not. That, he understood, was the whole cruelty of the thing. She was so unremarked that 4 grown men could stake her future on a card without troubling to picture her. She had been standing in the corners of these very rooms, night after night, season after season, plain and patient and invisible, holding other girls' fans, and not one of them had ever once looked at her long enough to see whether there was anything behind the plainness at all. Cassian Everleigh had spent 3 years being invisible in his own way, present at every table, wanted at every table, and seen by no one. He knew, better than these braying fools could imagine, exactly what it felt like to be furniture in a lit room. Let me be certain I understand the terms, he said, and his voice had gone quiet, which was the voice they feared without knowing why. You propose that I go to a respectable young woman of good family, whom none of you has ever addressed with a civil word, and offer her marriage, not out of regard, not out of duty, but as a jest to amuse you. And for this you will forgive my losses at the table tonight, which are, I remind you, considerable. £840. Peverell said prettily and grinned. You have had a wretched run, Fenwold. Even the great cannot beat the cards forever. Cassian looked down at the litter of pasteboard before him, the fallen kings and drowned queens, and felt the strange, still anger in him harden into something like resolve. He had not intended, when the evening began, to do anything at all that mattered. He rarely did. He drifted through his nights the way a man drifts through a house he no longer loves, touching nothing, and he had assumed this night would be like all the others, long, loud, and forgotten by breakfast. But he was thinking now of a woman he had never seen, standing against a wall with an armful of borrowed fans, and he was thinking that these men meant to make a laughingstock of her without her ever knowing she had been offered up, and would go on to their beds well pleased with themselves. And he found he could not bear it. "Don," he said. The single word dropped into the room and stopped every glass halfway to every mouth. "Don?" Harburn repeated, uncertain whether to be triumphant or alarmed. "You have proposed a wager," Cassian said, rising, and he was surprised by how steady he felt, how nearly awake. "I accept it. I will offer Miss Ashcroft my hand, and if she is fool enough to have me, I will wed her, and my debts here are cleared. Those were your terms. I hold you to them before witnesses." He looked round the table, unhurried, and each man he looked at found something urgent to do with his hands. "You will forgive me if I do not stay to be congratulated." He took up his hat and gloves. At the door he paused, one hand on the cold brass of the handle, and turned back, and the smile he gave them was not a pleasant thing. "One correction, gentlemen," he said softly. "You called her my punishment. We shall see, by and by, which of us has been punished." And he went out into the raw grey coming on of morning, leaving 4 rich young men to sit in the ruin of their own joke and wonder, with a slowly gathering unease, what precisely they'd set in motion. He did not go home. He walked. London at the hour belonged to the lamplighters and the milk carts and the ragged, hopeful poor, and Cassian moved hatless in his mind, if not in fact, turning the thing over. He had done a rash thing. He knew it. By the cold light of the river he could see all the ways it might go wrong, and there were many. But underneath the alarm there was something he had not felt in a very long while, and it took him the length of a bridge to name it. It was interest. For the first time in 3 grey years, Cassian Everleigh had done something he could not predict the end of, and the not knowing woke him like cold water on the face. Her people lived, he learned by the discreet application of a footman and a small coin the following morning, in a narrow house on an unfashionable street in a part of town that had been genteel in the last century, and had since come down in the world with quiet, threadbare dignity. He presented himself at 3 o'clock, which was a barbarous hour to call, in a coat that cost more than the house's yearly rent, and watched the maid who opened the door turn the colour of ashes at the sight of the crest on his card. Mrs. Ashcroft received him in a parlour that had been dusted within an inch of its life to hide how little there was in it to dust. She was exactly as he had half remembered, a small, fluttering woman with a mother's desperate, calculating hope written plain across her face. And when the maid announced him, she rose so quickly she overset her work-basket, and a rain of buttons and thread went skittering across the worn carpet, and she did not so much as glance at them, because she was staring at the Duke of Fenwold as though an archangel had walked into her sitting room with mud on his boots. "Your Grace," she managed, "this is... I cannot think what—" "Forgive the hour, madam," Cassian said and bowed, and reflected that he had been discourteous and would be more so before he left, and that the woman deserved better and would not get it. "I have come on a matter concerning your daughter, Miss Ashcroft. Is she at home?" There was a small sound from the corner of the room by the window, and Cassian turned and saw her, and afterward he could never entirely explain, even to himself, what happened to him in that first moment of looking. She was not beautiful. He registered that first, honestly, the way one registers weather. She was tall for a woman and too thin, and she wore a made-over gown of grey muslin that had been washed past any colour it had once possessed, and her brown hair was scraped back into a plain knot with none of the artful, escaping curls the fashionable girls cultivated. She had been mending something. A length of lace lay across her lap, and she had risen with it still in her hands, and she was looking at him not with the swooning astonishment of her mother, but with something far more disconcerting. She was looking at him as though she were doing sums. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, and bowed. "Your Grace." Her voice was low and even, and there was no tremor in it. She set the lace down on the window seat with unhurried care, smoothing it flat, and only then did she come forward into the room. "You have walked a long way to reach us. Your boots are damp through, and the hem of your coat is grey with river fog. May I offer you tea before you say whatever it is you have come to say? It will be poor tea, but it will be hot, and you look as though you have not slept." Cassian, who had been the object of every species of flattery coldness, terror and calculation the world could produce, found himself entirely without a ready answer. No one in the whole of his adult life had looked at the Duke of Fenwold and observed that he had not slept, and offered him tea, and meant nothing by it but that he seemed cold. Marigold, her mother hissed, scandalized, "His Grace has not come for tea." "Then he shall have it anyway," Miss Ashcroft said pleasantly, "and he may leave it untasted, which is his privilege." She rang the bell before her mother could stop her, and gave a low word to the frightened maid, and returned to stand with her hands folded, and regarded him with that same steady, sorting attention. "Now, your Grace, you have the look of a man who has done something he half regrets and means to see it through regardless. I have 4 brothers, or I had. I know the look. Say what you came to say." "My mother will faint, but she keeps the sorts in her reticule for exactly such occasions, and she recovers admirably." He should have led into it gently. He had meant to. He had rehearsed, on the long walk, a dozen graceful approaches, each of which now seemed absurd, because none of them had reckoned on being looked at like a column of figures by a plain woman in a grey dress who was not the least bit afraid of him. So he told her the truth. It was not what he had planned, but it was, he found, the only thing he could say to her. "Miss Ashcroft, I will not insult you with a pretty story, because I do not think you would believe one, and I find I would rather you thought well of my honesty than my manners." He drew a breath. "Last night, at cards, 4 men whose names I will not soil your parlour with wagered that I would not marry the least sought-after woman in London. They named you. They meant it as a cruelty to you, chiefly, and to me for a jest. They intended that you should never know you had been the object of it. I have come to tell you that you were, because you have a right to know, and to offer you the choice they meant to make for you." He held her eyes. "I am asking whether you will marry me, not as a jest. I am too old and too tired for jests, but I will not pretend it began as anything but one, and you deserve to know the whole of it before you answer." Mrs. Ashcroft made a sound like a kettle and groped for her reticule. Miss Ashcroft did not move at all. She stood very still by the window, and the pale afternoon light came in across her plain grey gown and her scraped-back hair, and Casson watched a great many things pass behind her eyes in a short time, hurt first, and quickly mastered, then something harder and brighter that he could not name, and then, astonishingly, at the very end of it, the faint, unmistakable beginnings of amusement. "4 men," she said slowly, "wagered a great sum that no one would marry me, and you, to spite them, have ridden across half of London to prove them wrong by marrying me yourself." "Walked," he corrected, because it seemed important to be exact with her. "But yes, in substance, yes." "And what?" she said. Did they wager? He had not expected that question, and it was, he realized, exactly the right one. "My debts at the table. £840 forgiven if I go through with it." She tilted her head, considering, and there was that faint gleam again. "So I am worth £840 to you. It is more than I have ever been valued at in a ballroom. There the going rate for my company is a single dance, grudgingly given, and even then only when a young man's mother is watching and his own preferred partner is engaged." She said it without self-pity, as a plain matter of fact, the way she had noted his damp boots. "Your Grace, I am going to ask you 3 questions, and I beg you will answer them as honestly as you began. My whole future rests on them, so you will understand I mean to have the truth." "Ask," and found he was leaning toward her. "First, if I refuse you, if I have the sense to see that a man who offers marriage out of spite will very likely tire of the bargain by Michaelmas, will you be ruined? Will these men have your money, your standing, anything you cannot spare?" "No," he said. "The debt is nothing to me. I could pay it 10 times over and never notice. The wager was never about the money." "Good." She nodded once, as if a line in a ledger had balanced. "Second question. If I accept you, knowing what you have told me, that this began as a cruelty and might end as a regret, do you give me your word as a gentleman and as a man that you will never once, in all the years of it, throw that beginning in my face? That you will not, in some low hour, remind me that you married me for a jest and a debt, because I could bear a great deal, your Grace. I have borne a great deal. I could not bear that." The room was very quiet. Mrs. Ashcroft had forgotten to faint. Somewhere below, the frightened maid was rattling the tea things. "You have my word," Cashin said, and he was surprised by the roughness in his own voice. "On my father's grave, which is the only oath I hold sacred, I will never once reproach you with it. Whatever comes of this, that beginning belongs to me and my folly, and to those 4 men and their meanness. It will never be a stick I use to strike you, that I swear." She looked at him a long moment, and he had the strangest sensation of being weighed on a very fine and very honest scale, and of not entirely knowing whether he would be found wanting. "Third question," she said softer now. "Why? Not why did you accept their wager? A proud man might do that in a temper, and I take it you are proud. But why did you come here and tell me the truth of it, when you might so easily have come with flowers and a lie and had a far smoother morning of it? You have handed me a knife, your grace, and told me exactly where your heart is. Why?" And this, of all her questions, was the one he could not answer glibly, because he did not entirely know the answer himself. He stood in the shabby, spotless parlour, in his too fine coat, and he thought of 3 grey years, and of being seen by no one, and of a woman he had never met standing against a wall with an armful of borrowed fans, while the whole bright room looked through her as though she were glass. "Because," he said at last, slowly, "for 3 years no one has looked at me and seen a man. They see a title or a fortune or a cold fellow to be frightened of, and I have let them, because it was easier than being disappointed. And I thought, walking here, I thought that you have spent 4 years being looked through in exactly the opposite way, and that perhaps 2 people who have each been made invisible, one by too much and one by too little, might at least understand one another. It is not love, Miss Ashcroft. I will not lie to you and call it that. But it is not nothing, and I have grown very tired of nothing." She was silent for so long that he thought he had lost. Mrs. Ashcroft had begun quietly to weep into her reticule, though whether from joy or terror not even she could have said. Then Marigold Ashcroft crossed the little parlour, and stood before the Duke of Fenwold, and looked up at him. She was tall, but he was taller, with those clear, sorting, fearless eyes. "I have one condition," she said. "Name it." "When we go into society as man and wife, and we must, for you will not hide me away, I can see that already. You are not a man who hides things. Those 4 men will be watching. They will expect to see a triumph. They will expect to see the great Duke of Fenwold saddled with a drab little nobody, ashamed of her, avoiding her eye, and they will laugh into their sleeves and pity you and feel very clever." Her chin came up. "I will not be pitied, your grace. I have been pitied for 4 years, and it is a colder thing than being despised. So my condition is this: whatever else this marriage becomes or fails to become, in public you will stand at my side, as though you had chosen me freely from every woman in England. You will not perform love. I would not ask you to lie so, but you will not perform shame either. Give me that, and I will give you a wife who will never once embarrass you, and who will make those 4 men choke on their own joke before the season is out. Is it a bargain?" Cassian Everleigh looked down at her, and something moved in his chest that had been still and cold so long he had forgotten its name, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the Duke of Fenwold smiled, really smiled, unguarded and startled, the way a man smiles when the world has surprised him into pleasure. "Miss Ashcroft, I begin to suspect I have made the best bargain of my life, and I do not yet know the half of why. It is a bargain, my hand on it." And he held it out. She took it. Her grip was firm and cool and unafraid, and behind them Mrs. Ashcroft dropped her salts entirely and gave herself up to happy hysterics. And the tea, when at last it came, was indeed very poor, and Cassian drank every drop of it, and thought it the best he had ever tasted. There was a great deal to be settled in the days between the bargain and the wedding, and Cassian discovered, in the settling of it, more of the woman he had agreed to marry than any courtship of the ordinary kind could have shown him. He had expected, when he sent his man of business to draw up the settlements, that Mrs. Ashcroft would fall upon the arrangement with grasping relief, and that Marigold would be embarrassed by her mother's greed and silent through it. He had prepared himself to be generous past all necessity, partly from decency and partly, he admitted privately, to salve his own conscience over the manner of the thing. What he had not prepared for was to find, when he called the second time, that Marigold had already read the settlements her mother could not follow, and had gone through them line by line with a pencil, and met him at the door of the parlour with the papers in her hand and a crease of disapproval between her brows. "Your Grace," she said without preamble, "this is far too much." He blinked. In 14 years no one ever told the Duke of Fenwold that anything he offered was too much. "I beg your pardon?" "The jointure. The pin money. This provision here, for my mother. You have settled upon her a sum that would keep 3 families in comfort, and upon me an allowance I could not spend in a decade if I gave myself over entirely to folly, which I have no intention of doing." She held out the papers. "It is kindly meant, and I am not ungrateful, but I will not have it. It looks like a conscience being bought, Your Grace, and I would rather come to you as a wife than as a debt you have paid off handsomely. Halve the jointure. Keep my mother's portion. She has earned some ease, God knows, and I will not deny her that. But the rest is vanity, and I will not begin our life together on your guilt. Begin it on your good sense instead, and I shall trust you the better for it." Cassian took the papers back and looked at the neat, damning pencil marks in the margins, and felt something he had not felt in years. He felt faintly ashamed, and beneath the shame an odd exhilaration. He had offered money because money was the only language of feeling he had left himself fluent in, and she had seen straight through it to the guilt underneath, and had refused to let him purchase his own comfort with it. "You are a very inconvenient woman," he said. "I have been told so," said Marigold, "though never, I confess, by a man proposing to marry me. It is rather bracing. Will you halve the jointure?" "I will halve it," he said, "if you will tell me one thing honestly. Why do you refuse a fortune you have every right to take?" "Your mother would take it. 9 women in 10 in your position would take it and think you a fool for scrupling. Why not you?" She was quiet a moment, and the crease smoothed from her brow, and she looked, suddenly, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Because I watched my father ruin us with money he did not earn and could not keep," she said simply. "He was always certain the next turn of the card would set us right, and every farthing that came into his hands went out again, chasing the last, and I learned, standing in the wreck of it, that money you have not made and do not deserve is a poison. It rots the man who takes it. I will take from you what a wife may fairly take, and I will earn the rest by being a good one. But I will not take a fortune handed to me to ease your feelings, because I have seen what unearned fortunes do, and I would sooner be poor again than be my father." She met his eyes. "Now you know the worst of me and the best of me in a single breath, Your Grace. I do not want your money. I want your respect. It is a great deal harder to give and worth a great deal more, and I mean to have it." Cassian folded the settlements slowly and put them away inside his coat, and when he spoke his voice was rougher than he intended. "You have it," he said. "You had it, I think, before you finished speaking. Halve the jointure and keep your mother's portion and Miss Ashcroft, Marigold. I begin to think those 4 fools have done me a greater service than any of us can yet imagine, and I hope one day to thank them for it, though I doubt they will enjoy the thanks." She smiled at that, the first full, unguarded smile she had given him, and it changed her plain face utterly. Lit it from within, and Cassian, who had thought her merely striking in her honesty, saw for one disconcerting instant something that no one in 4 seasons of London ballrooms had ever troubled to look long enough to see. "There," she said, "that was almost a compliment. We shall make a husband of you yet." And she rang for the poor tea, and they sat together in the shabby parlour and talked of practical things, of when the license would come, and which of her few possessions she would bring, and whether her mother might keep the little house or be happier removed to the country. And Cassian found the hour passed with an ease he had not known in company since before the world went grey, and left it reluctantly, and thought about her the whole way home. He learned other things in those 11 days. He learned that she had taught herself Italian and a little Greek from her dead brother's schoolbooks, having had no governess the family could afford past her 12th year. He learned that she kept a commonplace book of everything she read, dense with her small firm hand, and that she blushed for the first time he had seen when he found her writing in it and asked what it was. He learned that she was frightened of exactly one thing in all the world: thunderstorms. A childish terror she had never outgrown and was mortified to confess, and that she had a low, sudden, unexpected laugh that she seemed half surprised by whenever it escaped her, as though laughter were a luxury she had learned to ration. He learned that the servants of the shabby house, all 2 of them, adored her, and that the tradesmen of the street trusted her, and that the ruined family had been held together for 6 years not by the fluttering mother, but by the plain, quiet, competent daughter whom the whole of London had agreed to overlook. By the 11th day, standing beside her at the altar of St. Ninian's in the grey morning light, watching her make her steady responses in that low, even voice without a tremor in it, Cassian Everleigh was aware that he had come to the wedding of a woman he had known a fortnight, and that he understood her better already than he had ever understood a soul in his life, and that the strange still calm he felt, taking her cool hand in his before the clergyman, was not the calm of a man doing his duty, but the calm, though he had no name for it yet, and would not for weeks, of a man who has, entirely by accident, come home. They were married 11 days later, by special license, in the small grey church of St. Ninian's near the Fenwold town house, and if the ton had known of it in advance there would have been such a crush at the doors that no one could have breathed. But Cassian, who understood the appetites of society as a huntsman understands his hounds, had told no one. He wanted the news to break not as gossip whispered before the fact, but as a thunderclap after it, when the thing was done and irreversible, and no one could stop it or spoil it. He need not have troubled himself with strategy. The 4 men had done his work for him. Unable to keep their triumph to themselves, Peverell and Harborne and the others had spread word of the wager through every club in St. James's within a day of making it. And so by the time the marriage lines were signed, all fashionable London was breathless with the delicious scandal of it. The cold Duke of Fenwold, undone by his own pride, tricked into wedding the drabbest wallflower in England. This was the part they savoured most. Apparently going through with it, the great fool, rather than cry off and admit himself bested. They laughed at her before they had ever seen her as his wife. That was what Cassian did not forgive in the days that followed, and what hardened in him into a cold and patient resolve. They laughed at Marigold Ashcroft in her grey made-over gown, whom they had never spoken to, and they laughed at him for being caught, and the whole town settled in to enjoy the spectacle of a great marriage curdling into a great humiliation, as though it were a play got up for their amusement. Cassian had not, when he made his reckless wager, given a moment's thought to what came after the wedding. He had acted on a night's anger and a single clear impulse of decency, and had left the future to look after itself. But now the future was upon him, and it wore the shape of a tall, thin woman in grey who came to live in his grey-echoing house on Grosvenor Square, and he discovered in the first strange days of it that he had not the smallest idea how to be a husband, and no notion at all how to be one to her. He had braced himself, if he was honest, for awkwardness, for a house made heavier by a stranger's silent presence, for a wife who crept about the edges of his rooms, grateful and frightened and dull, whom he would come to resent the way one resents a duty. He had steeled himself to be kind to her out of principle, since he could not be devoted to her out of feeling, and he had thought that this cool, correct kindness was the most the bargain could ever yield. He was wrong about all of it, and he began to discover how wrong on the very first morning. He came down to breakfast braced for silence and found instead that the breakfast room, which had been a cold, formal, unused place since his brother died in it 3 years before. He had never told anyone that Edmund had collapsed at that very table with his coffee still steaming had been changed, not grandly. Nothing had been bought or rearranged. But the heavy curtains that his mother had hung a generation ago had been drawn fully back, so that the morning sun came flooding in across the floor, and someone had cut a great armful of the neglected roses from the ruin of the garden and crammed them, unfashionably, gloriously, into a plain jug on the sideboard, and the room smelt of green things and coffee instead of dust and grief, and his wife was sitting at the foot of the long table with a book open beside her plate, reading entirely at her ease, as though she had breakfasted in that room every morning of her life. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, without looking up until she had finished her sentence, which he found he liked. "There is a passage here I mean to read you, if you have no objection, once you are fed and less inclined to bite. You have the look of a man who is not to be spoken to before his coffee. I shall respect it. There is toast under the cover, and it is still warm, because I heard your step on the stair." He sat down slowly. He looked at the roses and at the flooding light and at the empty chair his brother had died in, which she had, without knowing, without possibly knowing, filled with sunshine. "You have changed the room," he said. She glanced up then, quick and a little wary, reading his tone. "I have opened the curtains and stolen your roses. If either offends, say so, and I will have it all put back. I did not think, it seemed a shame, your grace, to have such a garden and never bring any of it indoors. But it is your house, and I overstep," he said. And then, with difficulty, because he had never said it to anyone, "My brother died in this room, at that end of the table. I have not been able to eat in here since. I take my breakfast in the study, off a tray, standing up, like a groom. I did not tell the servants why. I do not know why I am telling you." Marigold set down her book. She did not gush, or exclaim, or reach for his hand with the ready shallow sympathy he had come to loathe. She sat quite still for a moment, taking it in, and then she said gently, "Then I am doubly glad I opened the curtains. A room where someone was loved and lost ought not to be left in the dark to become a tomb. It ought to be filled with light and roses and the ordinary noise of living, so that when you remember him, and you should remember him, always you remember him in a warm, bright place, and not a cold one." She paused. "What was his name?" "Edmund," Cassian said, and to his own astonishment his voice caught on it, the way it had not caught in 3 years. "Edmund," she repeated softly, giving the name its due. "Then good morning to Edmund's brother, and to Edmund's memory, in Edmund's bright room. Now eat your toast, your grace, before it goes cold and gives you one more thing to brood over." He ate his toast. He found, to his amazement, that he could. And that was the first morning. There were others. Each of them undid, in some small and unexpected way, the picture he had built of what his life would be. He had thought her plain, and she was. But he began to notice, across the crowded days, how much a plain face gained when it was intelligent and unafraid. How her whole countenance transformed when something caught her interest, so that a woman he would once have passed in a ballroom without a glance became, in the ordinary light of his breakfast room, a face he found himself watching. He had thought her humble, and she was not, or rather her humility was of a different kind than he had expected, without a shred of servility in it. She thanked the servants and learned their names and their troubles within a week. And the great cold house that had run for 3 years on grim efficiency and fear began, subtly, to warm, so that he heard something he had not heard within those walls since before his father died. He heard a housemaid singing on the stairs, and she was clever. That was the thing he had not been prepared for, the thing the 4 braying fools at the card table could never have imagined, because they had never once addressed a sentence to her worth answering. Marigold Ashcroft, Marigold Everleigh, now Duchess of Fenwold, had a mind like clear water, quick and deep and honest. She read everything. She had views on everything, which she offered without apology and defended without heat, and which were, more often than Cassian's pride quite liked, entirely right. She had, it emerged, been managing her mother's ruined household for years on almost nothing, and she looked at the accounts of the Fenwold estates when he left them lying and found, in a single afternoon, 2 small thefts and 1 large folly that his own steward had missed for a 12-month. She did it not to interfere, but because, she said, she could not bear to see a thing done badly when it might be done well, and she said it holding out the figures to him with such frank, unassuming competence that he felt not the affront he might have expected, but a strange, warm, unfamiliar thing that he only much later understood to be pride. He had married her to spite 4 fools and settle a debt. He had promised her only that he would not shame her in public. And within a fortnight he was aware, with a kind of quiet alarm, that he was beginning to look forward, each morning, to the moment he heard her step upon the stair. The world, of course, knew nothing of this. The world was waiting avid for the marriage to fail. And the world was about to have its first look at the new Duchess of Fenwold, for Cassian had accepted, on both their behalves, an invitation to the season's most glittering event, the Marchioness of Wexford's grand ball, the very crush at which all fashionable London would be gathered, and at which, he knew it as surely as he knew his own name, every eye would be fixed upon his wife, waiting to laugh. He came to her the evening before it, in the small sitting-room she had made her own, where she sat mending, always mending. She could not keep her clever hands still, and he stood in the doorway a moment watching the candlelight on her bent head before she knew he was there. "Tomorrow," he said, "we go to Wexford House. You know what they expect." "I know exactly what they expect," Marigold said, setting down her work. "They expect a beaten dog. They expect me to shrink and stammer and hide behind you, and they expect you to be ashamed. And when we give them neither, your grace, they will not know what to do with us." She smiled, and it was not a nervous smile. It was the smile of a general who has read the ground. "I have been thinking a great deal about tomorrow. May I tell you my plan?" And Cassian Everleigh, Duke of Fenwold, came into the room and sat down across from his extraordinary wife and said, with a lightness he had not felt in years, "Your Grace, I can imagine nothing I should like better." The great house on Grosvenor Square had been run for 3 years by a housekeeper named Mrs. Fitch, a rigid, competent, unhappy woman who had learned to keep the Duke's household in a state of flawless silent order, because the Duke could not bear noise or change, or anything that reminded him that the house was alive when his brother was not. The servants moved through their duties like well-trained ghosts. Nothing was ever out of place. Nothing was ever warm. And Cassian, who had built this frozen perfection himself out of grief and never once questioned it, watched his new wife dismantle it in a fortnight without seeming to try, and was astonished by the ease of it. She did not command. That was the thing he could not at first understand. He had assumed a duchess ruled a household by decree, as he ruled his estates from above and at a distance. Marigold ruled hers by going down into it. Within 3 days of the wedding she had been below stairs, in the kitchens and the servants' hall, not inspecting but sitting, drinking a cup of the servants' own strong tea and asking the cook her opinion of the fish, and learning that the second housemaid's mother was ailing in Southwark, and that the boot boy had a gift for figures and no schooling, and that Mrs. Fitch herself had lost a son to the same fever that had taken the Duke's brother in the same season, and had never been permitted to speak of it because grief in the house was the Duke's alone. Cassian learned all of this by degrees, as the house changed around him. He came home one afternoon to find the boot boy installed at a small table in the corner of his own study, laboriously copying sums under the eye of his secretary, and when he raised a brow, Marigold, passing with an armful of the eternal roses, said only, "The child her head for figures wasting in a boot room, and you have a secretary who complains he cannot keep up with your correspondence. I have introduced them. If it does not answer, we will send him back to the boots none the worse. But I do not think it will need sending back." It did not. The boot boy became, in time, an under clerk and then more. But that was years off and belonged to the long good ending of things, and Cassian at the time knew only that his silent, frozen house had somehow acquired a child doing sums in the corner, and a cook who sang, and a housekeeper whose rigid face had begun unaccountably to soften. "You are undoing 3 years of my work in a fortnight," he told her one morning, not entirely in complaint, watching her across the roses. "Your work was to keep the house from feeling anything," Marigold said quite gently, "because you could not bear to feel anything yourself, and a house takes its temper from its master. I do not blame you for it, Cassian. Grief is a hard master, and it ruled you well. But you are not only grieving now, or I hope you are not, and a house cannot stay frozen forever without the frutting into the people who live in it. Mrs. Fitch lost a son, did you know, the same winter as your brother. She has carried it alone for 3 years in this cold house, because there was no room in it for any grief but yours. I have given her leave to speak of him. That is all I have done. I have given a great many people in this house leave to be alive again, and it turns out they were only waiting to be asked." Cassian set down his coffee. "I did not know about Mrs. Fitch's son." "No," Marigold said without reproach. "You could not have. When a man is drowning, he sees only the water. But you are not drowning now. You are standing on your own feet in your own bright breakfast room eating toast, which a month ago you could not do, and I think you will find, as you look up, that a great many people around you have been quietly drowning too, in the cold you made without meaning to, and that it costs very little to throw them a rope." She reached across and touched his hand briefly. "You are not a cold man, Cassian Everleigh. You are a warm man who was frozen. There is all the difference in the world, and I knew it the moment you told me the truth in my mother's parlour when a lie would have served you better. Now, Mrs. Fitch has asked whether she might hang her boy's likeness in her own room, and was afraid to ask you herself. May she? Of course she may, Cassian said, and his voice was not steady. Tell her no. I will tell her myself. I should have told her 3 years ago. And he rose and went down into his own kitchens for the first time since he had inherited the house, and found the rigid housekeeper who had served him faithfully through the worst years of his life, and told her, awkwardly, that he was sorry for her loss and sturrier still that he had left her to bear it alone, and watched the woman's iron composure break into weeping, and understood, standing there among the copper pots, that his wife had just taught him more about being a duke in one morning than his father had taught him in a lifetime. The ton, meanwhile, watched the marriage the way one watches a slow-burning fuse, waiting for the explosion. It was inconceivable to them that the thing could simply work. A wager marriage, a cold duke and a drab nobody, and no scandal, no quarrels, no whispered separation, no mistress installed in discreet house across town. It was not to be borne, and so they invented what they could not observe. Cassian heard the stories filter back to him as such stories always did, that the Duchess was breeding already and the marriage a rushed necessity. She was not. That the Duke kept her mewed up because he was ashamed of her. He took her everywhere. That they lived at opposite ends of the great house and never spoke. They could hardly be got to stop. He learned to let the stories break over him like weather. But he noticed that they wounded Marigold more than she would admit. Not the cruelty of them, which she was armoured against, but the sheer indefatigable appetite of it, the way a whole city could feed for weeks on the private life of two people it had never troubled to know. They will grow bored eventually, he told her, one evening when a particularly poisonous piece of gossip had reached them and he had found her sitting very still and pale in her sitting room, mending nothing, her hands idle in her lap for once. I know they will, she said. It is not that. I have been talked of unkindly before. I can bear it. She was quiet a moment. It is only, I spent 4 years being invisible, Cassian, and I thought that was the worst thing that could happen to a person, to be looked through. And now I am looked at by all of London, and I find it is worse in its way to be seen by everyone and known by no one, to have 1,000 people with opinions about a woman none of them has met. I did not think being wanted could feel so much like being hunted. She looked up at him and tried to smile, and did not quite manage it. Forgive me, I am being foolish. I have everything I could want, and I am sitting here complaining of being a duchess, which the girl I was a month ago would have called the blackest ingratitude. Cassian came and sat beside her and took her idle hands in his. You are not being foolish, he said. You are being honest, which is a thing I have come to depend on from you rather more than is wise. And you are right. To be seen by everyone and known by no one is a wretched, hollow thing. I have lived it for 3 years, from the other side of it, wanted at every table, known by no one at any of them until he stopped. He had been going to say something too large. He drew back from it. Until lately, he finished. So I will tell you the only cure I have found for it, which is the one you gave me without knowing. It is to be truly known by one person, only one. It does not matter then how many thousand strangers have opinions, because there is one place where you are seen entire and loved for the whole of it, and that place is a fortress no gossip can breach. He pressed her hands. You have made this house that place for me. Let me be it for you. Let all of London have its opinions. Come home to the one person who knows you, and let the rest of them starve on rumour, for they will never have the truth of you, not the smallest part of it. That is ours. She looked at him for a long moment, and the colour came back into her face, and she turned her hands over in his so that they were palm to palm. When did you become so wise? She asked low. I did not, Cassian said. I married someone who was, and I have been shamelessly repeating everything she says back to her at moments of crisis. It is the whole secret of my sudden reputation for depth. I recommend the method to any man, and she laughed at last. The low, sudden laugh he had come to listen for, and the poison of the day's gossip lost its power, and they sat together in the lamplight until it was late, and the great house held them warm. Wexford House blazed like a beacon that could be seen from 3 streets away, and as the Fenwold carriage joined the long crawling line of them at its gates, Cassian felt the particular tightening in his chest that he had not felt since he was a very young man, not yet certain of his place. The sense of walking knowingly into a room that has already decided to be against him, except that it was not against him tonight. It was against her, and that, he found, he minded far more. "They will announce us," Marigold said quietly beside him. She had said very little in the carriage, but her hand, resting on her knee, was perfectly steady, and Cassian had come to know her well enough already to understand that stillness in her was not fear, but its opposite, a great gathering of purpose. And the whole room will turn. It always does at these things, but tonight they will turn on purpose, to see the drab little Duchess and to see whether her husband cringes. So we will not give them a scurrying woman and a shamed man. We will give them nothing to feed on at all. We will simply be married. Contentedly, unremarkably married, as though we had been so for 20 years and found it agreed with us. Boredom, your grace, is the one thing gossip cannot digest. Give them a scandal and they feast for a month. Give them a happy, dull, ordinary couple with nothing to hide, and they starve. He looked at her in the swaying carriage light. She was not dressed grandly. She had refused, gently but immovably, the fortune in silk and diamonds he had wished to drape her in, and had chosen instead a gown of deep, plain green, not the drab grey of before, for he had insisted on that much. And she had allowed it, cut with severe elegance, unornamented, but for a single strand of his grandmother's pearls at her throat, the pearls she had accepted only when he told her, truthfully, that they had hung unworn in a strong-box for 20 years, and grew dull for want of a living throat to warm them. Her brown hair was dressed simply. She wore no jewels in it. Beside the peacock splendor of the women they were about to face, she would look like a plain psalm sung in the middle of an opera, and she would, Cassian understood suddenly, looking at her, be the most dignified woman in the room. "You're not afraid," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have been afraid for 4 years, your grace," she said, and turned her clear eyes on him. "Afraid of the corners and the whispers and the long walk to the supper room on no one's arm. I have decided I am done with it. The worst thing they can do to me tonight is exactly the thing they have already been doing to me for 4 seasons, and I survived it plain and poor and alone. I shall survive it a great deal better as a duchess on the arm of the handsomest man in London." She said the last with a sudden flash of dry humour, and Cassian absurdly felt his colour rise. "Now, we are at the door. Give me your arm, husband, and do try to look as though you can bear the sight of me. That," he said low, as the footman opened the door and the light and noise poured in, "will require no acting at all." She glanced up at him, startled, and for just a moment the general's composure flickered and something younger and less certain showed beneath it, and then it was gone, mastered, and she laid her gloved hand on his arm, and the Duke and Duchess of Fenwold went up the great staircase together into the roar of the ball. The major domo drew breath and struck the floor with his staff. "His Grace the Duke of Fenwold," he cried, "and Her Grace the Duchess of Fenwold." The effect was everything the 4 fools could have wished. The vast room did not fall silent. It was too large and too crowded for silence. But it turned in a great rustling wave that started at the foot of the stairs and rolled outward. Hundreds of faces swiveling up toward the entrance, hundreds of fans stilling, hundreds of conversations dying midword. Cassian felt the weight of all those eyes land on the woman at his side, felt the greedy, gleeful, waiting cruelty of them, and his jaw set hard, and he prepared himself to carry her through it by main force if he had to. He need not have prepared anything. She carried them both. Marigold, Duchess of Fenwold, paused at the head of the stairs, not shrinking, not hurrying, but pausing with perfect composure, exactly as though she had all the time in the world and the whole room had assembled to await her convenience. She surveyed them, unhurried, her chin level, her plain green gown and her single strand of pearls making every jewelled woman in the room look suddenly overdressed and anxious. And then she smiled, not at any one person, but at the room entire, a warm, calm, faintly amused smile. The smile of a woman entirely at home in her own skin who finds the fuss around her mildly diverting, and she descended the staircase on her husband's arm as serenely as if she were coming down to breakfast. Cassian heard at his shoulder the first uncertain murmur run through the crowd. It was not the murmur they had come to make. They had come to whisper, "Poor thing, and did you ever," and how he must be squirming. But the woman descending toward them was not a poor thing, and the man beside her was not squirming, and confronted with a couple who seemed serenely, boringly content, the great predatory beast of the ballroom did not quite know where to sink its teeth. The Marchioness of Wexford, who was too great a hostess to show her hand, came forward to greet them with practised warmth, and Marigold received her with a grace so easy and so natural that the Marchioness, Cashen saw it happen, revised her opinion in the space of a single sentence, going from wary condescension to genuine interest between one breath and the next. "Your Grace," the Marchioness said, "we are so very glad. You must let me present you to—" "You are very kind," Marigold said, "and I should like nothing better, but I wonder if I might first beg the smallest favour. I have admired your Wexford house from the street these 4 years, and never once been inside it, and I am told the library here holds a folio of botanical drawings that is one of the finest in England. I am a very poor duchess, and a shameless one, ma'am. I would rather see your library than dance a single dance. Might I later if the crush allows?" It was exactly the right thing to say, and Cashen understood, watching it land, that it had not been an accident. The Marchioness of Wexford was famous for 3 things: her balls, her jewels, and her library, of which she was inordinately, secretly proud and which no fashionable guest had troubled to admire in 20 years. Her face bloomed. She took Marigold's arm as though they were old friends. And the drab little wallflower duchess, whom the whole room had gathered to pity, spent the first quarter hour of her grand entrance being escorted about the finest ball of the season by its formidable hostess, the 2 of them talking with animation, while the ton looked on in gathering, baffled confusion. Cashen let himself be drawn a little apart, and watched, and understood that he was watching something remarkable. He had married her to spite 4 men. He had thought her clever in the private way of the breakfast room. He had not known, he could not have known, that she possessed this, the ability to walk into the most hostile room in England with nothing but her wits and her composure and her frank, disarming honesty, and to bend it quietly, without a single raised voice or wasted motion, entirely to her will. They found the 4 men, of course. It was inevitable in such a crush. Peverell and Harborne and the other 2 had come, naturally, could not have stayed away, had come precisely to gloat, and Cashen saw them across the room in a knot near the card-room door, and saw the moment they realized the evening was not unfolding as they had planned. Their faces were a study. He might have laughed, had he been a man given to laughing in public. It was Peverell, flushed with wine and wounded vanity, who could not leave well enough alone. He came weaving across the floor as the musicians struck up, and planted himself before Cashen and Marigold with an unsteady bow, and so loudly enough to be heard by the nearest 20 people, which was the point of saying it at all. Fenwold, the new Duchess. "We are all agog, your Grace. All of London is agog. Such a romantic tale. Tell me, ma'am," and here he leaned in, and his smile had teeth in it, "do you know yet how it was your good fortune came about? Has your husband told you the, shall we say, the particular circumstances of his proposal?" The nearest 20 people leaned in. This was what they had come for. This was the cruelty at last, to see the drab little wife learn, in public, before them all, that she had been won on a bet, to watch her face crumple and her husband flinch, and the whole thing collapse at last into the humiliation they had been promised. Cashen felt the old cold anger rise in him like a tide, and he opened his mouth to strike Peverell down with words that would have made an enemy for life. But Marigold's hand tightened just slightly on his arm. Wait, and it was she who answered. "Do you know, my lord," Marigold said, in a clear, carrying, perfectly pleasant voice that reached every straining ear in the vicinity, "I do know the particular circumstances. My husband told me himself, the very first hour we met, before ever I consented to have him. He is an honest man, you see, perhaps the only truly honest man I have met in a London ballroom, which I confess has lowered my expectations of the breed." A soft laugh moved through the listeners, and it was not, Cashen realized with a jolt, aimed at him. "He told me that 4 gentlemen, I use the word loosely, and I imagine you take my meaning, sat a card table and wagered that no man of consequence would ever stoop to marry me, and that he, hearing it, was so offended by the smallness of their souls that he rose up then and there and swore he would." She let that settle. The circle of listeners had grown, Peverel's smile had begun to curdle. "So you see, my lord," Marigold went on, and now there was steel under the sweetness, though she never once raised her voice, "you have quite the wrong end of it. You imagine I was the jest. But I was never the jest. You were." 4 grown men, with fortunes and titles and every advantage England can bestow, sat down together and could think of nothing finer to do with an evening than to be cruel to a woman none of you had ever spoken to. That is not power, my lord. That is not wit. That is the meanness of small boys pulling wings from flies, and it is a very poor recommendation for a husband, which is perhaps why. She glanced with mild, devastating pity at his empty ring finger. "You remain unmarried while I do not. My husband looked at the same wager and saw a chance to do a decent thing. You looked at it and saw a chance to do a cruel one. I leave it to the good company here to judge which of you the wager truly measured." The silence that followed was of a different quality entirely from the greedy hush of the entrance. It was the silence of a room that has watched an execution and found itself, to its own surprise, on the side of the condemned. And then someone laughed, a woman somewhere near the back, a great, genuine, delighted peal of laughter, and it broke the dam, and the whole circle went up in it, laughter that rolled outward through the ballroom as the story leapt from mouth to mouth, and every particle of that laughter, Cassian understood, was directed not at his wife but at Peverel, who stood scarlet and swaying and stricken in the middle of it, made ridiculous before the entire ton by a woman in a plain green gown whom he had come to humiliate. "You," Peverel managed, and could find nothing further, and turned and fled, and his 3 fellows melted away from the card-room door before he reached them, wanting suddenly, urgently, to be seen with anyone but him. Marigold watched him go with an expression of grave courtesy, and then she turned to Cassian, and under cover of the din she said very softly, so that only he could hear, "Was that too much? I confess I have wanted to say something of the sort for 4 years, and it rather ran away from me at the end." Cassian looked down at his wife. He was aware of the room around them, of the laughter and the whispers already transmuting into a new story, a far better story, the story that would run through London by morning and never quite be corrected, the story of the drab little duchess who had turned out to be the cleverest, coolest, most quietly formidable woman in England, and had unmade the man who mocked her with 3 sentences and a level voice. He was aware that the wager had turned entirely, irrevocably, in the space of a single speech, and that by tomorrow every lord who had laughed at him for being caught would be envying him instead. He was aware of all of it, but mostly he was aware of her, of Marigold, his wife, looking up at him with a flicker of genuine anxiety beneath the composure, honestly uncertain whether she had overstepped, honestly caring what he thought, and he felt the last of the cold thing in his chest, the thing that had been frozen solid since Edmund died in the bright breakfast room, crack clean through and fall away. It was perfect, he said. It was the finest thing I have ever seen done in a ballroom, and I have wasted a great many years in ballrooms. And then, because he found he could not help it, because the words rose up in him unbidden and true, "Marigold. Dance with me." She blinked. "You do not dance. Everyone knows you do not dance. You have not danced in 3 years, he said. "I have not danced in 3 years. I danced last with Edmund's wife at their wedding, and then the world went grey, and I put it away with everything else. I am asking you to dance with me, wife, before all these people, so that they may see exactly how thoroughly I have chosen you." He held out his hand. "Unless you would rather see the library." For a moment she only looked at him, and something moved across her plain, extraordinary face that made it, in the blaze of 1,000 candles, the most beautiful he had ever seen. And then she laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, and put her hand in his. "The library," she said, "will keep." He led her out onto the floor. The other dancers drew back to make room, murmuring, watching, and the musicians, catching the moment, slid into a waltz. Cassian set his hand at his wife's waist and felt her hand light and warm upon his shoulder. And they turned together into the music, and he found that his feet remembered what his heart had tried to forget, and that dancing with Marigold was as natural and easy as breathing had lately become in her company. "They are all staring," she murmured. "Let them stare," he said. "It is what they came for. I am only sorry to give them so happy a spectacle when they hoped for a wretched one." She laughed again, and he watched the lot alight her face, and as they turned beneath the great chandelier he became aware, slowly and then all at once, of a truth he had been circling for a fortnight without daring to name it. He had told her in her mother's shabby parlour that what lay between them was not love. He had believed it when he said it. He did not believe it now. Somewhere between the roses in the breakfast room and this waltz, without his ever noticing the moment of it, the bargain had quietly ceased to be a bargain and become the thing his whole grey life had been waiting for. He did not say it. It was too new and too large, and a crowded ballroom was no place for it. But he held her a little closer as they turned, and she looked up at him, and he had the sense she was so quick, she saw everything, that she had read the thought in his face before he had finished thinking it. They danced until the music ended, and when it did, and the floor erupted into the particular buzzing, delighted, scandalized commotion of a ton that has been thoroughly appended, the Duke and Duchess of Fenwold walked off arm in arm to visit the Marchioness of Wexford's library, and left the whole of fashionable London to reckon with the fact that the joke of the season had turned overnight into its greatest romance, and that 4 foolish men had, between them, done the Duke of Fenwold the single greatest favour of his life. Later, much later, when the carriage bore them home through the sleeping streets and Marigold had at last let the General's composure fall away and sat with her head tipped tiredly back against the squabs, her eyes half closed, looking spent and pleased and human, Cassian took her gloved hand in the darkness and held it, and neither of them spoke, and it was the most companionable silence he had ever known. "Thank you," he said at last, quietly, "for not being what they thought you were." "Thank you," she answered, not opening her eyes, but curling her fingers around his, "for looking long enough to find out I was not. And the wedding night that followed was their own, and belonged to no one else, and the door closed gently upon it. And if the great house on Grosvenor Square, which had been cold and dark for 3 long years, kept a light burning warm in an upper window until very late that night, no one who passed it in the street below knew the whole of what that small light meant, only that the Duke of Fenwold's house, which had seemed for so long like a house in mourning, looked at last like a house where somebody had, against all expectation, come home. If the Wexford ball had turned the wager in the Duchess of Fenwold's favour, it was a smaller and quieter conquest, some weeks later, that secured her place in the world beyond any hope of the 4 men to unseat her, and Cassian, who witnessed it, understood only afterward how narrowly it might have gone the other way, and how completely his wife's particular gifts had carried the day. The Dowager Countess of Marchburn was the most feared woman in London, and had been for 40 years. She was very old, and very rich, and very sharp, and she held court from a great chair in the corner of every important drawing-room like a small malevolent sovereign, dispensing ruin and favour with a word. A cut from the Dowager Marchburn could close every good door in the kingdom. Her approval could open them. She had approved of almost no one in living memory, had buried 3 husbands and outlived most of her enemies, and she took a connoisseur's pleasure in cruelty, having reached an age and a position from which she need fear no one's opinion of her at all. The ton went in terror of her tongue and courted her mercilessly, and she despised them for it, and said so, which only made them court her the harder. She had not yet passed judgment on the new Duchess of Fenwold. All London waited to see which way she would fall, for her verdict would be final. And when, at a crowded rout at Lady Sefton's, the Dowager's black glove hand beckoned imperiously across the room, and it was seen that she meant to summon the Duchess of Fenwold to her chair, a hush fell over that quarter of the room, and the vultures gathered, scenting blood. Certain that the terrible old woman meant to make sport of the gambler's daughter, and finish what Peverell had begun, Cassian moved to go with her. Marigold stopped him with a look. "No," she murmured. "If you stand at my shoulder it becomes a duke defending his wife, and she will despise us both for it and be right to. Let me go alone. I have handled sharp old women before. My grandmother could have taught this one lessons." And she went alone across the cleared and watching floor, to stand before the Dowager Countess of Marchburn, and Cassian could only wait, at a distance, his heart in his mouth, and watch. He could not hear all of it, but he could see, and he pieced the rest together later, when Marigold told it to him laughing in the carriage. The dowager, it seemed, had opened with a raking, insolent survey of the Duchess from her plain slippers to her simply dressed hair, and had said in a voice pitched to carry to the watching crowd, "So, you are the creature the whole town is prating of, the wager bride. I confess I expected something more decorative. You are very plain, girl. Whatever did Fenwold see in you? He might have had any beauty in England." And Marigold, Cashin saw her chin come up and knew that gesture and braced himself, had answered in a voice equally clear and equally carrying and entirely without heat, "He might indeed, ma'am, and a great many beauties tried very hard to make him. But he chose me, and I have puzzled over it a good deal myself, and I have concluded that it is because I am the only woman in London who never once tried to catch him. I had given up the enterprise entirely, you see. 4 seasons will cure a woman of trying. I think he found it restful." There was a silence, and then the Dowager Countess of Marchburn, who had not been surprised by anyone in 20 years, made a sound that the watching room had never heard her make. She barked out a short, harsh, astonished laugh. Restful, she repeated. "You are impertinent, girl." "I am honest, ma'am," Marigold said. "It is often mistaken for impertinence by people who are not used to it. I mean you no disrespect. You asked me a plain question and I have given you a plain answer, which I imagine happens to you rather less often than you would like, everyone here being far too frightened of you to tell you the truth about anything." Another silence, a dangerous one. The crowd held its breath. And Cashin, watching from across the room, saw the terrible old woman's eyes narrow and then slowly gleam. "Sit down," the Dowager commanded, and rapped the small chair beside her own with her fan. "Sit down here where I can see you. You are the first person to say a true word to me in this room in a decade, and I find I have not the least idea what you will say next, which has not happened to me since the old king's time. Sit, tell me about your father." I knew him a little, before he ruined himself. He was a charming fool and a wicked whist player, and I won a great deal of money off him once and he took it like a gentleman, which is more than most of these mincing wretches would. Tell me the truth of it, not the drawing-room version. The truth. And Marigold sat down beside the most feared woman in England, and told her the truth of it, the whole hard truth, the ruin and the grief and the years of holding a broken family together, told plainly and with either self-pity or false cheer, and the Dowager Countess of Marchburn listened, and asked sharp questions, and was answered sharply, and the two of them sat together in the corner of Lady Sefton's rout for the better part of an hour, while the whole astonished ton looked on. By the end of it the terrible old woman had laughed 3 more times, and had pronounced, in a voice that carried to every ear in the room, and was repeated in every drawing-room in London, by the following afternoon, her verdict. "This one," said the Dowager Countess of Marchburn, tapping the Duchess of Fenwold's arm with her fan, "is worth the whole simpering pack of you put together, and Fenwold is a cleverer man than his father ever was, which I would not have credited. I like her. She may call on me on Thursdays." She raised her voice a further notch, sweeping the watching crowd with a gaze of pure contempt. "And any fool who repeats that vulgar nonsense about a wager in my hearing may consider themselves cut. It was the best day's work Fenwold ever did, and the rest of you are merely jealous you had not the wit to do it first. Now go away, all of you, you are gaping." It was, Cashin understood, watching it, a coronation. There was no higher authority in fashionable London than the Dowager Marchburn, and she had not merely accepted his wife, she had adopted her, championed her, set the seal of her formidable approval upon the whole affair so publicly, and so finally that no one would ever again dare to whisper the word wager where it might get back to her. In the space of a single hour, Marigold had walked into the presence of the one woman who could have destroyed her with a word, and had left it as that woman's declared favourite, and had done it with nothing but the truth, offered plainly, to a person who had been starved of truth for 40 years. "How?" Cassian asked her later in the carriage, when he had done laughing and she had done being pleased with herself. "Did you know? She has terrified the whole of England for 2 generations. Strong men go pale when she beckons. And you sat down and told her she was surrounded by cowards, and she made you her favourite. How could you possibly have known it would answer?" "Because she is old and clever and rich and utterly alone," Marigold said, and everyone around her lies to her from morning to night out of fear, and has done for 40 years. And there is nothing lonelier in the world than to be surrounded by people who will not tell you the truth. I know it, Cassian. I watched you live it for 3 years from the other side. The powerful are lied to worse than anyone, and they grow hungry for one honest voice that they will forgive it, almost anything, will love it, in the end, more than all the flattery in the kingdom. I did not flatter her. No one had told her a true thing in a decade, so I told her true things, and she was so grateful she could have wept, only she is far too proud, so she made me her favorite instead. It is the same thing you fell in love with, my dear, if you did. I told you the truth in my mother's parlor when a lie would have served me better, and it undid you entirely. She smiled at him in the dark. Honesty is the rarest luxury in the whole glittering world, and I am one of the few people in it foolish enough to give it away for nothing. It has cost me a great deal over the years, but lately, she reached for his hand. Lately it seems to be paying rather well. Cassian raised her gloved hand to his lips in the darkness of the carriage, and did not answer, because his heart was too full for it, and thought that 4 foolish men at a card table had, between them, handed him the most remarkable woman England, and that he would spend the rest of his life astonished by his own undeserved good fortune. Of the 4 men who had sat at the card table that reckless night, 3 had the grace, or at least the prudence, to be ashamed of themselves once the tide of opinion turned against them. Cassian marked their progress with a cold and private attention, for he had not forgiven them and did not intend to, but he was a fair man beneath the frost, and he watched to see which of them was merely weak and which was truly wicked. Young Harborne came to him first. He was the youngest of the 4, not 21, and he had followed the others into the wager the way a puppy follows a pack, out of a desperate wish to be thought clever and grown. He came to Fenwold House one grey morning, white-faced and stammering, and asked to see the Duke, and was shown into the study, and stood turning his hat in his hands, and got out at last a broken and entirely genuine apology, not to the Duke, but for the Duke to carry to the Duchess, for he had not the courage to face her himself. "I have not slept, your Grace," the boy said miserably. "I keep thinking of it, that we sat there and that we spoke of a lady so, a lady who had never done us any harm, who did not even know and I laughed, sir. And now everyone knows what we did, and they are right to despise us, and I despise myself worse than any of them, and I cannot undo it, and I do not know what to do." He looked up wretched. "I only came to say I am sorry. It is not enough. I know it is not enough." But I could not go on without saying it. Cassian regarded the boy for a long moment. He had come prepared to be merciless and found, looking at the genuine anguish in the young face, that mercilessness would be its own kind of cruelty, and beneath his dignity. "Sit down, Mr. Harborne," he said, not unkindly. "You are right that it is not enough, and you are right to be ashamed. That shame is the most useful thing you own at this moment, and I advise you to keep hold of it, for it is the difference between a young man who did a cruel thing once and a man who becomes cruel. You are not yet the second. See that you do not grow into it." He paused. "I will carry your apology to my wife, and I will tell her that I believe it sincere, because I do. Whether she chooses to receive you is her affair and not mine. I do not command her forgiveness any more than I commanded her hand. But I will tell you this as one man to another, since you seem to want telling. The lady you helped to mock is the finest person I have ever known, and had you troubled any one of you in 4 years to say a single civil word to her, you might have discovered it for yourselves and been the better for the knowing. You lost that chance the moment you chose to laugh instead. That is your true punishment, Mr. Harborne, and it is heavier than any I could devise. You will spend your life having laughed at the best woman in London before you ever knew what she was." The boy left chastened, and Cassian thought improved, and Marigold, when the apology was carried to her, was quiet a while, and then said, "He is very young, younger than his years. Tell him I bear him no grudge, and that if he wishes to make amends he may do it not by grovelling to me, but by being kind ever after to some other overlooked creature standing against some other wall, for there is always one in every room, and now he knows how to see her." And so it was done, and young Harborne, who might have gone the way of the others, went instead into a decent life, and was in later years known as an unusually gentle man. particularly toward the shy and the plain, and never quite knew that the whole of his character had been redeemed in a single interview with a woman he had once helped to wound. Two of the others simply faded, drifted away from town, made themselves scarce, and were in time forgiven the way the world forgives everyone in the end, by forgetting. But Peverell did not fade and did not repent, and Cassian, watching, understood that Peverell was the truly dangerous one, because Peverell could not forgive the woman who had exposed him, and a man who cannot forgive the person he has wronged will always, given time, contrive to wrong them further. He kept a wary eye on Peverell. It was not wary enough, as the theatre would prove, but that grief lay ahead, and before it came a season of pure unlooked-for happiness that Cassian afterward remembered as the brightest of his life, for he was in love and knew it now, and the knowing changed the very colour of his days. It had crept upon him so gradually that he could not name the hour of it, but there came a morning when he understood past all denying what had happened to him, a perfectly ordinary morning, nothing in it, when he came down and found Marigold at the foot of the table reading, a smudge of ink on her cheek where she had leaned her face on her hand while writing in her commonplace book, entirely unaware of it, and she looked up and said something dry about the news in the paper. And Cassian felt his whole chest fill with a warmth so sudden and so total that he had to look down at his plate to hide it. He was in love with the ink on her cheek. He was in love with the low sudden laugh, and the crease between her brows when she disapproved of something, and the way she thanked the servants by name, and the frank, clear, sorting look she still turned on him sometimes across the table as though she were doing sums, and the truth she gave away for nothing to a world that did not deserve it. He was in love with his wife, whom he had married for a wager, and the wonder of it never left him. He did not tell her. He was afraid that he had, in the very beginning, told her plainly that it was not love, and had built the whole trust between them on that honesty, and that to come to her now and say the opposite would seem to her a thing said for convenience or gratitude rather than truth. He wanted to be certain she would believe him. He wanted the moment to be unmistakable. And so he waited and loved her in silence, and showed it in 100 small ways he hoped she read. In the roses he began, absurdly, to cut himself before she came down, so that some mornings the jug was filled before she reached it. In the small green-bound volume of botanical drawings, a rival to the Marchioness of Wexford's very folio, that he tracked down through 3 booksellers and left on her writing table without a word. In the way he found excuses to be in whatever room she was in, and put off engagements he had once fled to, and lingered at the breakfast table long after his coffee was cold, only to hear her read him a passage from her book. And Marigold, who saw everything, saw this too, and said nothing either, and waited and hoped, and did not quite dare to believe it, because she had been overlooked for 4 years and had schooled herself hard against hope, and a woman does not unlearn that schooling in a season, even for the kindest of husbands. So they went on, the two of them, each secretly and helplessly in love with the other, each afraid to be the first to say it, each showing it in silence and reading it in silence, and neither quite certain of the other, until the night at the theatre when Peverell shouted a dead man's shame across a crowded house, and everything that had been held back so carefully came out at last in a single terrible, cleansing rush, and the wager that had begun in cruelty was finished forever in love. There was one night, in that bright unspoken season before the theatre, that Cassian carried afterward like a coin in his pocket, turning it over in dark hours for the rest of his life. A great storm came up over London late in the evening, the kind that rolls in off the sea and stands over the city for hours, and the first thunderclap broke directly above Grosvenor Square with a violence that rattled every pane in the great house. Cassian, in his study, thought nothing of it beyond a passing satisfaction that he was warm and dry, and then he remembered, all at once, with a lurch, the one thing his wife had confessed to fearing in all the world, the childish terror she had been mortified to admit. And he was up and out of his chair, and taking the stairs 2 at a time before the second peal had finished sounding. He found her not in her sitting room and not in her bedchamber, but in the small dark passage between them, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped about them, a grown woman, a duchess, huddled in the dark like a child, flinching at each flash, and Cassian's heart turned over in his chest at the sight of her. Marigold. He was down on the floor beside her before he had thought about it, his fine coat forgotten in the dust of the passage. Marigold, I am here. Go away, she said, into her knees, her voice thick and furious with shame. I told you it was childish. I cannot help it, I have never been able to help it. And I will not have you see me so, go away. Cassian, please. The lightning flared and she flinched hard, and a small broken sound escaped her that she would have died rather than let the ton hear. He did not go away. He sat down on the floor of the dark passage in his ruined coat, and he put his arm around his trembling wife, and he drew her in against his side firmly, so that her face was against his shoulder and the storm was at his back and not hers. I am not going away, he said, low and steady, and there is nothing to be ashamed of, and I will tell you why. Do you know what I feared as a boy? Not thunder. Something far more foolish. I feared the dark, the true dark, a room with no candle, and I feared it until I was nearly grown, long past the age when it was seemly, and my father shamed me for it, and my brother, his voice caught and steadied, my brother never did. Edmund used to come to my room when the candle was taken away, every night for years, and sit with me until I slept, and never once told a soul, and never once made me feel less for it. That is what a person does, Marigold, for someone they love. They do not shame the fear. They sit in the dark with you until it passes. So I am going to sit here in this passage and hold you until the storm is over, and I am not going anywhere, and you may be as frightened as you like, because there is no one here but me, and I have loved a frightened person before and thought no less of them for it. I thought more. She had gone very still against him. The thunder rolled again, further off now, and she flinched but less, because his arm was firm around her and his voice was in her ear. You loved him very much, she said at Muffmost. Edmund, more than anyone in the world, Cassian said. Until, and he stopped. It was there again, the thing too large to say, rising up in the dark and the closeness and the honesty of the moment, and he almost said it, until you. But the fear held him back one more time, the old fear that she would not believe it, that it would seem a thing said in a storm and not meant, and he let it pass, and only tightened his arm and said instead, until now, my life has people in it again, Marigold. It did not for 3 years. It has you in it now, and Mrs. Fitch weeping over her boy's likeness, and a boot boy doing sums in my study, and a house full of light and roses and singing on the stairs, and I did not do any of it. You did. You walked into a tomb and made it a home, and I have not yet found the words to tell you what that is worth to a man who had given up on ever having a home again. He pressed his cheek briefly against her hair. So sit here with me and let the storm pass, and know that you have given me back a great deal more than you will ever let me thank you for. The storm passed. It rolled away east over the sleeping city, the thunder growing fainter and the flashes further between. And Marigold's trembling eased by slow degrees, and still they sat on the floor of the dark passage, her head on his shoulder and his arm around her, long after the last peal had died, because neither of them wished to move, and neither of them said so. Cassian, she said at last, very quietly, into the returning quiet. Thank you for not going away. I will never go away, he said, and meant it with his whole heart, and it was, he thought later, as near as he came to telling her the truth of it before the theatre forced the whole of it out of him. I will never go away, and she must have heard something in it, some weight beneath the words, for she turned her face up in the dark and looked at him, and he could just see, by the last far flicker of the departing storm, the question in her eyes and the hope she did not dare to speak, and he held her gaze and did not look away, and something passed between them in that dark passage that neither had the courage yet to name, but that both from that night quietly knew. He helped her up at last when the rain had settled to a gentle steady falling, and saw her to her door, and there they stood a moment, close, in the dim light of the single candle she had left burning, and Cassian lifted his hand and very gently tucked back a strand of hair that had come loose from her plait, and let his fingers rest a moment against her cheek, and Marigold turned to face the smallest fraction into his hand, unthinking the way one turns toward warmth, and the two of them stood there, husband and wife, on the threshold of everything, not quite touching and not quite apart. until Cassian, with an effort that cost him more than she could know, drew back his hand and bade her good night in a voice not entirely steady, and went to his own room and lay awake a long time listening to the rain, full to the brim with a happiness so large and so undeserved that it frightened him nearly as much as the storm had frightened her. For he had a fear of his own, deeper than any dark room, the fear that had ruled his whole grey life since Edmund died, and it was this, that everything he loved was taken from him, and that to love a thing fully was to invite its loss. He had built the frost around his heart precisely to guard against it, and Marigold had melted the frost without even trying, and now he loved her past all guarding, and the old fear whispered in the dark that a happiness so complete could not be safe, that the world would find some way to take her too, as it had taken his father and his brother, and leave him colder than before. He was wrong to fear it as it happened. The world would try at the theatre, and would fail, and their happiness would prove the sturdier thing. But he did not know that yet, lying awake in the rain, and the fear kept him company until dawn, and taught him, though he cursed it at time, exactly how much he had to lose, so that when the test came he did not hesitate, but stood up in a crowded house and staked his whole cold reputation on a woman he had married for a joke, because by then she was not a joke to him at all. She was the whole of his heart, and he had only been waiting all along for the courage to say so. The weeks that followed were, Cassian later thought, the happiest of his life, and he did not know it fully until they were nearly taken from him. London, having made up its collective mind, threw itself into adoring the new Duchess of Fenwold with the same whole-hearted energy it had lately reserved for pitying her. Invitations poured in. Hostesses who would not have known Marigold Ashcroft from a chair back a month before now begged the honour of her presence, and the drawing-rooms that had looked through her for 4 seasons now competed to lionize her. She bore it all with the same dry, level composure, neither dazzled by the attention nor embittered by remembering its absence, and Cassian watched her navigate the sudden flood of fashionable friendship with a wisdom that humbled him, for she was kind to the newly kind without ever quite trusting them, and reserved her real warmth for the small handful, the Marchioness of Wexford chief among them, who he came to see had earned it. But it was not the ballrooms that made him happy. It was the mornings. Every morning he came down to the bright breakfast room, and every morning she was there before him with her book and her roses and some observation saved up to share, and every morning the cold grey weight he had carried for 3 years was a little further off, a little less able to find him. He told her about Edmund in pieces across those mornings, the whole of it, at last, the illness that had come so fast, the guilt of having quarrelled with him the month before over nothing that either could now remember, the terrible 3 years' silence in which Cassian had punished himself by refusing to grieve out loud. Marigold listened. She did not try to mend it or explain it away. She only listened and remembered, and once weeks in said quietly, "You did not fail him, you know. You simply loved him," and did not get to say the last of it, which is the common tragedy of the whole human race and no special crime of yours. And Cassian, who had waited 3 years for someone to say a true thing to him instead of a comforting one, put his head down on the breakfast table among the roses and wept for his brother at last, and his wife held his shoulders and let him, and did not say another word until he was done. He told her, too, of the estate of Fenwold Abbey in the North Country, the great grey house of his boyhood that he had not been able to set foot in since the funerals, that he ran through stewards and letters and never visited, because every room of it was full of ghosts. And Marigold, listening, said only, "One day, when you are ready, we will go there together. Ghosts are far less frightening in company, and I should like to see where you were a boy, before the world taught you to be a duke." He did not answer, but he did not forget it, either. It was into this new and unfamiliar happiness that the shadow fell, and it fell as such things do, from a quarter he had not thought to watch. Peverell had not forgotten his humiliation. A smaller man than his vanity, he had spent the week since the Wexford ball nursing his wound in the back rooms of his club, and being avoided by the very set who had once cheered him, and blaming for all of it not his own cruelty, but the woman who had exposed it. And a man like Peverell, unable to strike at strength, will always, given time, find a way to strike at what he imagines to be weakness. He could not touch the Duke. But he had learned, by patient malice, a thing about the Duchess, and he chose the cruelest possible ground on which to make it public. It happened at the theatre. The Fenwolds had a box, and they were much observed in it these days, the fashionable world craning to watch the famous couple. And Peverell, half drunk, wholly reckless, past all caring for his own ruin so long as he could spread some, rose in the pit during the interval, in the full hearing of the crowded house, and called up at their box in a voice pitched to carry, a toast to the Duchess of Fenwold, the gambler's daughter. Let us drink to the memory of her father, Sir Henry Ashcroft, who diced away his family's last farthing and put a pistol to his own head to escape his creditors, and to his daughter, who has diced her way rather higher, from ruin to a ducal coronet on the turn of a card, a true daughter of a gaming man. The theatre gasped. It was the one thing everyone had wondered and no one had dared say, the manner of old Ashcroft's death, which the family had buried in shame, which Marigold had never once spoken of, even to Cassian, even in their most open mornings. Cassian fell rigid beside him in the box. He turned and saw her face, and it was white as paper, and the composure that had carried her through every hostel room in London was, for the first time, cracking clean across, 'cause this was not an attack she had prepared for. This was her deepest and most private wound laid open before 1,000 staring strangers, and worse, far worse, he saw in her stricken eyes the thing that Peverell had truly aimed at, the thing crueler than any insult, shame that he, her husband, now knew it too, and had learned it like this. Cassian Everleigh rose from his seat in the box. The whole theatre saw him rise, and the whispering died, and every face turned up to the tall, dark figure of the Duke of Fenwold standing very straight and very still in the full light, and no one in that house had ever seen him look as he looked now. Sir Henry Ashcroft, Cassian said, and his voice was not loud, but the theatre had gone so silent that it carried to the topmost gallery, was, by every account I have heard, a weak man and a poor father, who failed the people who loved him and left them to bear the cost of his failures. In this, my lord, and now he looked directly down at Peverell, and the whole house followed his gaze. He and you have a very great deal in common, and I begin to see why the subject rises so readily to your mind. A sound went through the crowd, half gasp and half something darker, delighted. But here is the difference between them, Cassian went on, and mark it well, for it is the whole of the matter. Sir Henry Ashcroft, whatever his sins, produced in his lifetime one thing of surpassing worth, a daughter who took his ruin and his shame and his early grave upon her young shoulders, and bore them for years without complaint, kept a household together on nothing, and grew up under the weight of them into the wisest, kindest, and most honourable person I have ever had the privilege to know. That is what a gaming man's daughter is, my lord. She is not her father's shame. She is his one redemption, and she is my wife, and I would not trade 1 hour of her company for the whole braying pack of you and your kind laid end to end. He paused and his voice dropped, and it was the quiet voice, the one they had all learned to fear. You have spoken of her father's death to wound her. Understand me clearly. If you ever again speak my wife's name or her father's, in public or in private, in this city or out of it, I will not call you out. You are not worth the powder. But I will use every particle of my very considerable influence to see you barred from every respectable door in England, and you will end your days precisely as poor Sir Henry did, friendless, ruined, and alone. That is not a challenge, my lord. It is a promise, and you know me well enough to know I keep them. He did not wait for a reply. He turned his back on the pit, the gravest insult one gentleman could offer another, and the whole house understood it, and he held out his hand to his wife. Come, my love, he said gently, and only she was near enough to hear how his voice shook on the endearment. We are going home. And Marigold, white-faced and trembling and looking at him as though she had never truly seen him until this moment, put her hand in his, and let him lead her from the box, and the theatre erupted behind them into a roar that drowned the play entirely, a roar in which, this time, there was not one particle of pity and not one that was aimed at her. She did not speak in the carriage. She sat very still, her hands clenched in her lap. Her face turned to the black window, and Cassian, who had learned to read her silences, understood that this one was not composure, but the far side of it, A woman holding herself together by main strength around a wound torn open after years of careful covering. He did not press her. He only sat close, so that his shoulder touched hers with the swaying of the carriage, and let her know without words that he was there, and would remain there, however long the silence lasted. It lasted until they were home and up the stairs and alone at last in the warm lamplit sitting room she had made her own, with the door shut against the great echoing house, and there at last, standing in the middle of the floor with her back to him, Marigold's shoulders began to shake. "I never told you," she said, low and broken, "about my father, how he died. I meant to someday when I was braver, but I could not bear for you to know, to think of it, that I came to you out of that. And now the whole of London knows before you did, and you learned it shouted from a pit by a drunkard, and her voice failed. I have shamed you. That is what he wanted, and he has done it. A duke's wife, and her father a suicide and a ruined gambler, and everyone knowing." Cassian crossed the room and turned her by the shoulders so that she faced him, and he saw that she was weeping, Marigold, who had not shed a tear before the whole cruel ton, weeping now in the safety of her own room, and it undid him more thoroughly than any speech, any theatre. "Listen to me," he said. "Look at me, Marigold. You have shamed me. You?" He gave a laugh that was half a sob. "My love, I stood in that box tonight, and I have never in my life been so proud to say a name aloud as I was to say yours. Do you understand me? I did not learn a shameful thing about you tonight. I learned that everything I already knew of you, your steadiness, your kindness, the way you carry weight without complaint, the way you looked after your mother and your ruined house without ever once growing bitter. I learned where all of it was forged. In grief and shame and hardship that would have broken a lesser soul entirely. Your father's death is his tragedy and his failing. It is not yours. You did not fail him any more than I failed Edmund. You told me that yourself, do you remember? And I need you to believe it now as I have come to believe it, because you were right, and you were right about me, and now I am right about you." She was shaking her head, the tears coming faster. "You are only saying it to be kind." "I have never in my life said anything to be kind," Cassian said, and it was true enough to startle a wet laugh out of her, and he seized on it. "There. You know I have not. I am the cold Duke of Fenwold. I am famous for it. If I say a thing, I mean it. And I am about to say the thing I have been circling for 6 weeks like a coward, so you will attend to me, wife, and you will believe me, because I am not a man who says it lightly, and I will very likely never manage to say it again half so well." He took her face in his hands, wet and blotched and dear, and he said it. "I love you, not out of gratitude, and not out of duty, and not because you unmade a fool in a ballroom, though I confess I loved you a very great deal in that moment. I love you because you walked into my grey ruined life carrying flowers, and opened the curtains and were not afraid of me or of anything, and because you saw a man where the whole world had agreed to see only a title. And because in 3 years of darkness you are the first thing that has felt like morning. I married you for a wager, and I would not undo it if you offered me the world, because that reckless, foolish, drunken dare is the single best thing I have ever done, and I will spend the rest of my life being grateful to 4 contemptible men for handing me the only happiness I have ever known. I love you, Marigold. It is said, and I meant every word, and I defy you to weep at me now." She wept a great deal more, in fact, but differently now, her hands fisted in the front of his coat, her face pressed to his chest, and when at last she lifted it, streaked and swollen and shining, she was, he thought, entirely beautiful, and he told her so, and she laughed at him through the tears and called him a liar, and then she said the thing he had been waiting for without knowing he waited. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since the morning you told me your brother died in that room, and let me open the curtains anyway. I did not dare to say it. I thought, a wager, a debt, a man who told me plainly it was not love. I thought I must be content with kindness and never hope for more, and I schooled myself to it. And then you stood up in that theatre." Her voice broke again and steadied. "No one has ever stood up for me in my life, Cassian. Not once, not ever. I have always been the one who stood up for others and was left standing alone. And you turned your back on the whole of London for me, for a gambler's daughter in a made-over gown." She pressed a hand flat over his heart. "How could I not love you? How could anyone not? A great many people managed it for 38 years, Cashin said, and I am inexpressibly glad they did, for it left you for me. And he kissed her, at properly, his gambler's daughter Duchess in her lamplit room, and the great house held its warmth around them. And the shadow that had fallen at the theatre lifted and did not return. Peverell fled London within the month. Cashin never needed to lift a finger against him. The ton did the work themselves, closing its doors one after another to the man who had shouted a lady's grief across a public theatre, until London had no more use for him and he went abroad and was not missed, and the other three, wiser or only more fortunate, made their quiet peace with being nobody's favourites and were in time forgotten. The wager passed into legend, and the legend, as legends do, kept only the sweet part and let the cruelty fall away, so that within a year all fashionable London agreed that the Duke of Fenwold had, in a stroke of romantic genius, married for love the cleverest woman of her generation, and that the four men who had thought to shame him had merely revealed their own smallness, and had been rightly punished for it. Every telling of it made the Duke wiser and the Duchess more brilliant, and neither of them ever bothered to correct it, because the true story, the whole of it, belonged to them alone, and was better than any legend, and they kept it for themselves. In the spring they went north at last, together, to Fenwold Abbey. Cashin had dreaded it for 3 years. He crossed its threshold with his wife's hand in his and found the ghost smaller than he had feared, exactly as she had promised. And by the second day he was showing her the tree he had fallen from at 7, and the pond he had nearly drowned in at 9, and the long gallery where he and Edmund had fought their boyhood battles. And he found he could speak of Edmund at last, not with the old choking grief, but with something nearer to joy, because there was someone beside him now who wanted to hear it, and who laughed in the right places, and who understood that to speak of the dead with delight is the truest way to keep them. Marigold walked through the great grey house, opening curtains and cutting roses and learning the servants' names, and the abbey, which had stood shuttered and mourning for 3 long years, came awake around her the way the town house had, room by room, light by light, until it was a home again and not a tomb. They stood together that first evening on the abbey's south terrace as the sun went down over the hills of his boyhood, and Cashin, watching the light turn his wife's plain brown hair to bronze, thought of the man he had been 6 months before, the cold, grey, sleepless Duke who had sat at a card table with nothing to lose, because he had already lost everything that mattered, and had thrown away his debts on a reckless dare out of pure black weariness with his own life. That man had thought himself beyond saving. That man had accepted a woman as a punishment, and Cashin, standing on the terrace of his childhood home with his wife's warm weight against his side, and the whole of his ruined heart made new, marvelled that so much could have come from so reckless a beginning, and knew that he had only just crossed the threshold of the long good years that lay ahead. The years that followed were long and good, and unfolded so gently that Cashin was often astonished, waking in the grey of some ordinary morning, to remember the man he had been before and to measure the distance he had come. Fenwold Abbey became their true home, and they went to London only when duty called them, and were always a little glad to leave it. The great grey house in the north filled, over the years, with the sound of living, with guests and books and music, with the Marchioness of Wexford come up to stay, and the Dowager Countess of Marchburn, older and sharper and more devoted than ever, who declared the Abbey the only house in England worth the journey, and the Duchess the only woman in it worth the talking to, and who left at her death her formidable collection of botanical folios to Marigold, with a codicil in her own crabbed hand that read only, "To the one honest woman I ever met, do not let the fools grind it out of you." Marigold wept over it, and kept the folios in a place of honour, and told the story of the old terror at Lady Sefton's rout to their guests on winter evenings, until it became a family legend, softened and burnished by the retelling, though she never let them forget the truth beneath it, that the powerful are lonelier than the poor, and that kindness costs nothing, and that an honest word is the rarest gift in the world and ought to be given freely. There came, in the fullness of time, the patter of small feet in the long gallery where Cashin and Edmund had fought their boyhood battles, and a small hand tucked trustingly into the great Duke's own as he showed the tree he had fallen from and the pond he had nearly drowned in, and Cassian, who had feared for 3 grey years that his line and his love had both died with his brother, found the abbey ringing once more with the sound he had never expected to hear in it again. He would not have believed, that reckless night at the card table, that any of it could come to him, the warmth, the home, the small feet on the stairs, and he never entirely stopped being astonished by it, and told Marigold so, and she told him, dry as ever, that he might try to be a little less astonished and a little more useful, and handed him the household accounts, and he laughed, and did as he was bid, because he had learned long ago that his wife was almost always right, and that the surest road to happiness lay in cheerfully admitting it. He never again saw the 4 men of the card table, save Harbon, who grew into the gentle man his single act of contrition had promised, and who came, years later, to stay a week at the abbey, and who wept quietly one evening, telling the Duchess to her face at last how sorry he had been all those years, and how the memory of what they had done had shaped him for the better ever since, and Marigold forgave him wholly, and told him he had more than made his amends, and Cassian watched his wife lift the last of a young man's old guilt from his shoulders with a few kind words, and thought that he had never loved her more. Peverell died abroad unmourned some years on. The news reached them at breakfast, and Cassian read it out, and there was a silence, and Marigold said only, God rest him, he was a cruel man, but a small one, and I think he was never happy a day in his life, which is punishment enough for anyone. I am glad we did not have to hate him. Hatred is such a weight to carry, and he was never worth the carrying. And she went back to her book, and the roses, and the morning sun, and the matter was closed, and Cassian marvelled once again at the size of the soul he had won on the turn of a card. For that was the truth of it in the end, and Cassian came to see it whole in the long good years he had been given by pure reckless accident, by a drunkard's cruel joke and a proud man's flash of temper, the one thing his cold, careful life could never have found for him by design. He had gone looking for nothing, had gone looking, if he was honest, for oblivion, and had stumbled instead upon everything. The wager had been meant to punish him. It had saved him. The bride they had thrown across the table as a jest had turned out to be the whole meaning of his life. And the men of the ton who had envied him by the morning after the Wexford ball, who had looked at the Duke of Fenwold and his brilliant, unexpected wife and gnawed themselves with jealousy, had envied, all of them, only the shining surface of it, the wit and the triumph and the romance of the tale. They had never guessed at the true treasure underneath, the mornings, and the roses, and the storm nights, and the honest voice across the breakfast table, and the small hand in his in the long gallery, and the warmth of a house that had been a tomb and was a home, and a woman who had looked at a frozen man and seen, past all the frost, the warmth waiting to be thawed. They stood together on the Abbey terrace many an evening as the years drew on, watching the sun go down over the hills. And Cassian would draw his wife against his side, and neither would speak, for they had long since passed the need of it, and the light would turn her brown hair to bronze exactly as it had that first spring evening, and he would think, every time, the same simple, astonished thought that had never once worn thin in all their years together, that he was the most fortunate man in England, and had done nothing to deserve it, and would spend whatever life remained to him giving thanks for the reckless dare that had, against every law of sense and probability, brought him home. What are you thinking? She would ask, as she always asked, leaning into him. The same thing I am always thinking, Cassian would answer, as he always answered, and press his lips to her bronze-lit hair. That they called you my punishment, and gave me my whole heart's desire, and never knew the difference. Let them go on not knowing. It is the best-kept secret in England, and it is ours. And the sun would go down behind the hills of his boyhood, and the great house behind them would glow warm and golden in every window, lit from end to end and full, after all the dark and silent years, and against every expectation the world had held for either of them of light, and roses, and the deep abiding quiet of 2 people who had, by the most reckless accident and the truest love, found and kept and treasured, all their days, their unlooked-for way home.